All right, this is the in-depth analysis portion. For anyone joining us, will be a two-part series. So yeah, we're talking about kind of this "Hello, Darkness, my old friend." This idea of um, kind of nihilism or depressive sort of anti-heroes and endings in movies and video games, more importantly.
Yes, and like we said in the intro, this was inspired by a Crack.com podcast. I encourage everyone to go listen to it. They cover more music and movies and TV.
Hmm.
But when listening to it, I was like, man, I wonder if this is applying to games too. They were wondering, they basically described it as why are our favorite shows so bleak? Like they talked about how they were starting to dread Sunday nights, which is a nice
Yeah.
segue into hating Mondays, where it's like, oh yeah, so my favorite character's head got exploded, and my other favorite character died of cancer, and like I just called my mom, made sure she's okay. Like they're making all these jokes about how everything's super bleak on TV right now,
Right. Right.
and kind of talking about why it is. And I was wondering, is this something that's always been the case, and is this something that video games are starting to emulate? Because one thing with video games is they tend to want to be taken more seriously as an art, right? Like be more movie-esque.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, well, are the more popular, like the more, because not every TV show is doing this, right? Like you've got shows like Family Guy or Bob's Burgers or, there's Big Bang Theory that aren't trying to be depressingly like realistic,
Right.
but the ones that get really good critical acclaim are kind of going that way.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
I was wondering if the same pattern would happen in video games. So I started thinking about the kinds of video games that have been really popular just in the last year. And I was looking at just like the most successful financially. And I was looking at lists, and I'd see, your games like Madden and Pokemon are on the list, but also on the list were games like The Last of Us, uh, Bioshock Infinite, The Walking Dead, things
Hmm.
like that. So we are kind of seeing the same sort of tendencies towards bleak, God is dead and nothing matters themes.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Kind of a Breaking Bad or The Wire or No Country for Old Men, but in video game form.
This is really fascinating. As I was putting some time into thinking about it, and then like making sure my thoughts were aligned with research and whatnot. Yeah, there's a lot of cool things to say psychologically about it. But like, um, yeah, like there used to be a sort of a golden era, right? Like a little bit less like this, right? This sort of modern trend. Is that right?
Well, for TV and movies, it definitely was the case. That we used to have shows like Cheers and even Seinfeld, which was like a show about a bunch of jerks. Like they're not that big of jerks compared to like how like the Crack guys compared it to Modern Family, which is supposed to be a lighthearted, fun, optimistic comedy. But even that, when you watch it, like like the stuff they say about each other behind each other's backs, you kind of like. If that were happening in real life, you'd be like, "Are you guys okay? Is there a problem in your marriage? Like, you seem to really hate your husband."
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well, yeah,
even like optimistic shows tend to paint their optimistic heroes as kind of idiots. Like that's kind of the joke, right? Like The Office, like
yeah.
Michael is such an idiot, and that's why it's funny. Or Parks and Rec, like, oh, the one character is optimistic, she's so stupid, let's laugh at her. It's like even the comedies are kind of have a darkness to them, but and then the non-comedies, the things like there's this new one on HBO called The Leftovers, which is just super depressing. Like it's just bleak. It's about like a post-rapture world where 2% of people disappeared.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just all the really, Game of Thrones we've already mentioned, Breaking Bad, The Wire, The Sopranos, I think kind of kickstarted this.
Yeah.
But just lots of stuff where it's just like, okay, well, nothing really matters, and the good bad guys sometimes win, and that's just how life is.
Right,
And
right, right.
yeah, and I was thinking like this isn't super new because we've always used art to kind of channel darkness as a society. Before we even had TV, like our stories would have a lot of darkness in them. Like The Little Mermaid or Sleeping Beauty, like the movie versions are really nice, but in the actual, you ever read the actual Little Mermaid story?
No, no.
Oh my God! So Disney got a lot of things right. She does turn into a human. She needs true love's kiss to make the prince fall in love with her and marry her. However, the penalty is actually she dies if she fails in the original story.
Oh, wow.
And remember how she gets legs?
Yeah, yeah. She gives her voice away, right? Or singing.
Yeah, in this one, not only does she give her voice away, but there's an additional penalty in the original story. Every every step she takes feels like she's walking on sharp shards of glass.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, and and at first it seems like it's working, but then the prince ends up marrying another woman who he thinks is the woman that saved her. So Disney kind of did that too with like the witch shape changing.
Yeah, yeah.
But but the prince ends up marrying her, and the mermaid can't tell him that it's wrong because she can't talk. But then she's given a way out of the contract. She's told that if she murders the prince, she can turn back into a mermaid and doesn't have to die. But she can't do it, so she throws herself into the sea and turns into sea foam. The end. Happy ending.
Wow, that's pretty dark.
Yeah, and you want to get even darker. Look at Sleeping Beauty. In the original story, which Giambattista Basile is believed to have done the original Sleeping Beauty story, a king walks by the castle, knocks on the door, nobody answers, so he climbs up the ladder through a window. He finds the princess, calls her, but she's unconscious, and she does not wake up. So this is kind of similar to the Sleeping Beauty story in the movie, except at this point he rapes her.
What?
He just crawls in the bed. He carries her into the bed, has some coma sex, leaves.
Wow.
She awakens because she gives birth while she's asleep to twins.
What?
And one of the twins sucks the flax from the spindle out of her finger, which breaks the spell and wakes her up. The king comes back and ends up falling in love with her just by having raped her. But the king's still married to someone else, and his wife finds out and tries to have her twins killed, cooked, and fed to the king.
Wow.
And burn the princess at the stake, but she's unsuccessful. They end up getting married and live happily ever after. So.
What the heck?
Yeah, these stories are a lot like, Tangled, Rapunzel. Like Flynn ends up jumping out the window in despair and getting blinded by thorns because the witch makes him think that Rapunzel's dead. Snow White, like all these stories, they used to be a lot of darkness, and then darkness was something covered in literature after that. Like people would read these Russian novels or these realistic stories and just be like, oh man, like especially anything by Tolstoy. Just very much like, oh, human nature's the worst and everything's really sad.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But people don't read anymore. Well, we read, but it's online, right? Like most of what we read is like emails and web pages and stuff. So it felt like movies and TV kind of took up the banner a little bit. And then mostly TV, because movies were like, oh, whatever, we can still do summer blockbusters. But TV shows are more like novels in that since they're in episodes, it's like a chapter format.
Right.
Which is why I think shows like Game of Thrones do really well. But
and before that, weren't there like Greek tragedies and things? I mean, those ended pretty sickly usually.
Yeah, exactly. Like we used to channel our pain into art. This isn't a new phenomenon, but the mediums are changing the media is changing because of technology, and now video games come on the scene, and they kind of go through this thing where at first they were just trying to be games, and now they're trying to be more serious art pieces. Like especially The Last of Us. Have you seen the behind the scenes stuff with The Last of Us? Like they really wanted to prove that like this was a medium where you could have good acting and good voice acting and good storytelling, and not just a game.
Yeah, the guy actually who made it was thinking, I could make a movie or I can make a game, and then he said he actively made the decision to make a game and said, but I want it to have the high quality production of a movie. So, yeah, like it's very much trying to be an art form or an experience more than it is just like a series of decisions, a video game,
Right.
traditional thought of it.
And so, and this is kind of a some people kind of classify this as postmodernism. It's the idea of like, the French philosopher Derrida, he was big into deconstructionism, where you take everything apart and be like, okay, well, we're just making sounds, and sounds are just science, like nothing's actually like, and you find like the tropes of things and be like, oh yeah, but that's just a trope. What if we didn't do that trope? What if we did something else? And like, why are we doing, like, kind of challenging the conventions of what's happening? It's this postmodernism movement. But really, I think a lot of the modern TV, movies, and video games that we play now are almost into spiralism. Have you ever heard of that?
No. What is that?
It was actually found in Haiti by like a francophone guy in the 60s, and it kind of in nature things are really complex and ingeniously designed, but kind of random.
Yeah.
It kind of tries to make storylines that way, where you have everything kind of interconnected, but also unpredictable and governed by chaos. And very painful, like cycles of misfortune. So kind of like the way the world is, right? Like in the Cracked podcast, they gave the example of talking to a police officer who said that like it really makes you not believe in God, because sometimes somebody will open up fire into a crowd of people with a machine gun and nobody gets hit, and then the next day someone does that and like every bullet finds its mark. It's like super random.
Yeah, right.
So it kind of is this whole like there is no greater meaning outside of life thing that the spiralism movement was sort of focusing on.
Yeah, I'm familiar with a lot of the nihilists and the philosophy, like existentialism, regarding like what is the true purpose of us being here, and I kind of think like maybe the idea that really caught on like in the early maybe the late 1800s, early 1900s. I'm not really sure the timeline, but I think one of the big things that caught on was this. You remember Nietzsche's idea of like the Ubermensch, the Uberman. I think it's Mensch and Uberman, but basically Superman.
Ubermensch, yeah.
Yeah, and like, well, that idea, a lot of people toyed with that, but the idea that like, somebody, it's sort of like the great man hypothesis, like history books are written this way. It's like, oh, here are the great people.
Yeah, there's usually two tensions. There's the great man hypothesis and then like the moving forces.
Right, yeah, exactly. And so like, and the zeitgeist idea is like, like anybody could have been that person. It was just a matter of, this is the spirit of the era, and this person just stepped up and a series of circumstances made them that way. And, a lot of people are really starting to feel that way. There's a couple things. First of all, we're like in the golden age of science right now, where like we're in, at least in the beginning of it, where like a lot of our woes are kind of taken care of. For once, like you mentioned on the podcast before, that like many of our the idea of like not working is like an option now, at least for some people, and it's still frowned upon. But we're living to arguably as old as we can possibly get, before we just like, we're not even ambulatory anymore. We can't even walk around, and we're still living, because we have all these like, you've got all this modern medicine taking care of you, and you kind of just get so exhausted you don't even move, and then your body just from not moving just like starts getting blood clots and you die like that. It's just one of those like, we're clearly anywhere past our functionality,
right?
And, so we have time and all these wonderful things to help us. And I think like when that started kicking off, it was this age of discovery. It's like the sky's the limit, and like everything's looking great. There's no limited resources to worry about. Now we're starting
talking about the age of discovery, like discovering the new world, or the age of like the scientific revolution?
Well, I was drawing a parallel between the age of discovery, like discovering the new world. It's this the horizon is not a is not an invisible wall anymore. It's an option for discovery. Let's go out and see what we can do. It's not like, oh, we're stepping on people who already live here. Instead, it's like, oh, let's just take this. That kind of thing. No woes, to be had really. And then now we're starting to realize that, oh wait, there are limitations. Like we can like fuel. Like a lot of things we're kind of starting to worry about now. Like, or for example, like yes, we can like technologically like rebuild a heart, but should we do that? And can
scientists were so concerned about whether or not they could do it, they never stopped and asked themselves whether they should do it.
Yeah. So I'm kind of wondering.
Chaos theory, life finds a way.
Yeah. And so I think people, back then, like Superman comic was big. A lot of like these untouchable, bad guys or untouchable like good guys was kind of real popular in America. And then I think it started to become like, yeah, but is that really attainable? Is that really a thing? And psychologically, like we kind of with the popularity of psychology, it has become one of those things of like, why did that bad person do that? Rather than why they're just bad, kill them, right?
Yeah.
Now it's like, what led to that? And we're starting to humanize like people who were considered quote unquote evil before. We're starting to understand how they became where they are. And I think
we see the rise of the anti-heroes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Because of that, I think we see that possibility in all of us. Not like in the evil sense of like every one of us could be evil if not saved by some mystical power. Instead, it's like, oh no, just a series of life decisions. If I was born into like like in Africa, for example, like in one of the war-torn places, I would probably have a gun too by the age of 4, and I would think that like scalping people is a normal thing,
Yeah, it kind of goes back to our discussion on free will. Like if things are determined before you're born, you can't be responsible for that. And so much of what we are is determined before we're born, right? Like if you're born into a child army of African warlords, then that's you're gonna kind of shoot a lot of people. And so like it doesn't make you a bad person. It's just you don't have any other option.
Well, I think that the coolest part about this is like the kind of the rise of psychology and people understanding like why people do things, which we've been wondering about it for a long time, but now we actually have data, kind of applied science to it. Well, it's forcing people to at least question the idea that people are inherently bad or inherently good. But I think the good thing is, one, it's saving people who are considered evil. They can be reformed. Through like some interventions that we can do as psychologists or mental health professionals. But also, it lets people realize that, oh, I could be a hero. Like there's no such thing as like like Napoleon, for example. Like he was a great man, right? But there's nothing inherently awesome about him. It's not like he got the DNA that like made him a super awesome guy. It was more of like oh wait, he was woke woken every morning by his mom telling him, "Wake up, today you will do, or you're going to be a great man," or whatever. And she did that every single morning since he was an infant, before he could even understand what it was. Like it was a psychological intervention that's thought to have caused him to, self-fulfilling prophecy, labeling theory. Is you start looking at yourself and saying, "Oh, he's no different than me, or she's no different than me. I've got it within myself to be this great person," and so you can strive for it. So it's like shattering the glass ceiling between like the heroes above us flying in the skies and us down here that are cursed to our lot in life.
You're sounding a lot like Lex Luthor right now.
Yeah, and I desire it. I will wish it from the sky.
Why should he become a god? We should all be gods. Yeah, I find myself agreeing with Lex Luthor a lot, actually. I'm just like, yeah, fuck Superman. Why does he get to have all the powers?
Yeah, it's true.
But like we do see a lot of anti-heroes in modern film and TV and video games. Like on TV, you got your Walter Whites, you've got your Don Drapers, you've got your Tony Sopranos, you've got your Dexters. Like the white male anti-hero is a huge deal right now, and we see it in video games. Like Joel, I say, like, he starts off as a bastard, right? Like there's implications that he was he used to be a bandit. He just does whatever he needs to survive.
Yeah.
He slowly becomes a better man over the course of the game, but he certainly starts off as kind of a scumbag.
Well, I don't know. In the very first sections,
in the very beginning,
when life is like going well, he's doing great.
Well. Right, and that's a common trope too. Like everybody's good when life is good, but what happens when society falls apart? And
that's real bad. Isn't that what's cool about it? Since we're in this like golden age, aren't we looking at that and questioning ourselves? Like, yeah, we were born here in America. Most of our listeners are American, some aren't. But whatever you're listening to a podcast, you're probably pretty affluent. But that's probably because of where you're born. And so now we're thinking, what if we were born in these other places? Or like Joel, like what if we slipped down to one of those societies? So you were saying?
I was just saying, like, that might be part of why we're so fascinated with anti-heroes right now. Like, why we can relate to them is because I think right now, like, we're the most educated we've ever been. We're the most aware of what's going on. Like, I think there's almost a sense of cultural guilt. Like, right now, like, the shoes that I just bought at Walmart, they were like $7.
Wow.
Or maybe like 14. It was an inconsequential number. We'll say 14. They were $14. How we get the prices that low, I'd rather not think about, but I can't. Like, I know that the reason the prices are probably low is it was probably some Malaysian slave made the shoes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And or like when I order a hamburger, like how much damage am I doing to the environment by making them by eating a hamburger, not eating bugs? There's a whole bunch of things that we do as a modern society, and we're aware of. We're aware of how blessed we are, like blessed, #blessed. Like how lucky we are.
Yeah.
To be living where we are in the world, and we're aware that we could probably, if we really wanted to, make some positive changes and change our lifestyles, but it's so much work, and so we don't. And there's this kind of sense of almost like subconscious or like in the back of our mind guilt because of that. We don't dwell on it, but it's always kind of there if we want to think about it. We know, like, oh man, I could do so much more than I'm doing right now.
Well, how do you think that? So if we're the royalty of like today, like in the sense of we just happen to be born in the right place, at the right time,
the privileged class.
Yeah. Do you think my current theory kind of thinks that maybe information age has something to do with that? The fact that like it's immediately available, that the knowledge, and it's in our face that you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think in the past people have had that saying, there have been privileged classes as long as there have been, social humans. But I think we're the first one, thanks to this information age, that's just aware of how good we have it and aware of how bad other people have it. And so I think we do feel more guilt. Like I'd like to see a Pew study on this, but I think that we do feel more guilt than previous generations who just had a more myopic worldview where it's just like, here's me and my family, we're just getting by.
Yeah, like think about those people who come back from like some impoverished nation, like maybe they went to South America, one of the really poor places, or like maybe spots in Africa, or like in India, like where people are like, I'm not saying every part of each of those nations or each of those continents kind of is bad. It's just that I'm saying that like most they're certainly much more worse off on average by far, and so they go and they come back and it's pressed upon them. They think like, man, I want to help those guys out. They try to raise awareness a little, that kind of thing. Like when I was in Iraq, there was Ugandans there who were trying to serve as like private security forces. They basically just stood around and did like the non-dangerous jobs. Mm. Well, as they talked to me about their wages and what the life was like back at home, I was like, oh, that's horrible. So that sense of like proximity to the pain is like it kind of pushes up some guilt. And then what's funny is now though I can sit in my chair right here in Mississippi and I can Google or YouTube and like see the kind of the carnage or the destruction or like the poverty. I can just simply type it in, so it brings the proximity to my home. And so it's like having it right outside a specific door of your house, and you just never go out there because you don't want to see it. You know?
Right, and the fact that we know it's there and we're just avoiding it because we don't want to see it, like, kind of makes us shitty in some way. Like, it kind of gives us a sense of guilt. Like, oh man, like for the cost of what I spend on my SWTOR subscription, I could probably feed like 5 orphans.
Right.
And so, like, I think that's where this anti-hero thing comes from. Is like we're able to scapegoat all this kind of like cultural and societal guilt onto these white male anti-heroes, like freaking Dracula, you know, in Lords of Shadow 2. And
Yeah.
like, you don't feel so bad playing as them now. You can kind of relate to them almost. You're like, okay, yeah, you know what? It's okay to be a bad guy. It doesn't. It's not the worst thing.
Yeah.
We're all kind of bad. And like, I don't know, I wonder if a lot of this just comes from this fact that we're just so much more informed now, and then more able to kind of relate to these bad quote unquote bad guys, these anti-heroes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of that is it's kind of like in our Star Wars episode where we talked about the scariest thing about the Sith is that it's the danger inside of us. You know, it's the enemy within. And I think that's what's going on here is like, you know, we play these characters, you know, and that's what's so great about video games is, you know, you're in the pilot seat, you know, in a sense, obviously, just like in the world, you know, when you say you're responsible for your own decisions to, you know, an extent. But same thing in video games. Sure, you have parameters, but for the most part, you know, you drive forward and you do these things, like in Dracula or in Lord's Shadow, where you grab that person, suck their blood, you know, whenever you're trying to, like, when you stumble out of the coffin. Each of those decisions, you're like, yeah, but you know, like I'm now okay with that. Whereas like maybe in a 1950s mentality of like, you know, like there are evil people out there and we gotta put a stop to them, you know, maybe that wouldn't be so popular. But now like we can live with those decisions because it's sort of like we already noticed the evil within, like the fact that like I had a friend who moved to New York, right? She went on an internship and she said that while she was driving around, or not an internship, what's she doing over there? Oh, yeah, she was going to for Broadway stuff, and she saw homeless people, and she was like, ugh, that's so sad, you know, that these people are in the subways and stuff, and she felt like she needed to help them, and she would like strike up conversation with them. But now, and she was sad that like everybody just stepped over them. There was one that fell asleep right at the bottom of the subway stairs, and everybody's just stepping over him, right? And she was like, oh, how could they do that, you know? So she like woke him up, and like he kind of like leaned against the wall, and she's like, oh, I feel like I did my good deed. But then she found that like 2 months later, she was that same person stepping over people, you know.
And jaded to it.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like, you know, once you realize the scope of the problem and the fact that like it would have to be a large scale change, you know, you do become sort of like calloused to it, you know.
And I think that part of the appeal of that too, bringing it back to games, is a lot of these games follow like a redemption story almost. Like you're an anti-hero, like The Last of Us or BioShock Infinite. You're kind of a dick, both Troy Baker roles, or you know, the Lords of Shadow 2, like even Dracula trying to take him along a more redemption path maybe, and it kind of like gives you hope. You're like, oh man, like there's hope for all of us. Even the monsters can become heroes eventually, can become good people.
Right.
But sometimes it doesn't work, and that's another thing is somebody said, I forget who said it, that like there's no real atheists. Like everyone believes in some kind of God. When I heard that, I was like, well, that's stupid. That's a dumb thing to say, because like, yeah, clearly there are atheists. They have conventions, you know, like they call themselves atheists. They say I don't believe in God. But what they meant by that is in the storytelling sense. Like we all kind of have this innate belief in karma, right? Like we believe that in the end, the good guys are going to win. Like we believe that in a firefight, you have a better chance of shooting the bad guy as the bad guy has of shooting you. We believe that, you know, stuff that happens in a movie will get resolved. There's these storytelling tropes that we all just suspend our disbelief for because we want the story to be this way. We want eventually everything to kind of get their comeuppance and everything to kind of... So when I say no true atheist, I mean everyone kind of has a sort of karmic, not Judeo-Christian, but like a karmic God that they believe in. Like there should be a right or there should be a wrong.
Right.
Well, and that's what makes these games kind of interesting, is because they in this postmodernist way, they question those premises and start breaking away from convention.
Yeah, there's a strong like psychological precedent to this. You know, the just world hypothesis is what it's called. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am actually.
Okay. Yeah, essentially it's like everybody inside like kind of expects or hopes for more expects actually, because they do act. The difference between hoping and expecting is that, you know, you act upon one.
Right, and you feel like cheated if you don't get it.
Exactly. Yeah, you feel cheated. Exactly. Like, for example, like I expect that my if Amy says I'm going to cook tonight, and I expect it, and if it's not there, I'm like, what is this? Like you said you were going to. I'm behaving in such a way where there's consequences if that doesn't happen. And the same, and whereas like if she hadn't told me that, I might come home and I'm like, oh, I wonder if I'm cooking tonight. Who knows? You know, and I don't care if there's nothing on the table, you know, because then I'm like, oh wait, you know, it's whatever. Actually, I get home before she does, but that's a bad example. But whatever. Yeah, that's just world hypothesis. This is ingrained. Like, have you heard about these the primate kind of experiments of like of like kind of give and take that they have, the expectation.
Yeah, like well, they'll give certain like apes or monkeys like grapes, and they'll give the other one like not as many grapes, and like there'll be this sense of like, what? That's not fair. Like the sense of fairness or equity they have.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Like they feel cheated, and yeah, or yeah, my dogs do this a little bit too. Like if I give one like like a little treat because he went pee or poop, and the other one's like, wait, where's mine? And he just sits there looking at me and gets kind of anxious. And I don't know if that's true though, because that's kind of anecdotal. But still, something that we do know is true is like this has been replicated a couple times. The modality has been a little bit different, but essentially, I'll give you one example of this. There was two monkeys, right, and they're separated by a pane of glass. Well, there's a little hole that they can put their hand through. And on the other side, what they did was they gave one monkey a jar. They shut it real tight, and they put hazelnuts inside. And it's bonobos, I believe, actually, so apes. And the funny thing about bonobos is they're just, lol, ape shit about hazelnuts. They love them. And so, this monkey's trying to get in this jar, but it's sealed. I think it was super glued, if I remember right. But so he's like, oh, how do I get in this thing? So he starts, hitting it against the pavement. It doesn't work. And or hits against the ground. It's dirt. It doesn't work. And he's like, oh, man, I can't get this thing open. But they gave the other bonobo, that's when they hand him a hammer.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, and so they look at each other. He hits because the bonobo with the hammer's going nuts right now. He's like, oh my god, I want those hazelnuts too. So he starts hitting the glass pane, but it's reinforced, so nothing happens. And then he's got this hammer. The other one's got the jar. So you see how that works. Well, eventually they say, all right. So he hands the hammer through the hole and gives it to the ape with the hazelnuts. And so that ape obviously shatters it and gets the hazelnuts out. There's 5 there, and the ape actually hands 2 back to the one who gave the hammer to him. He should have eaten all 3 of those hazelnuts, obviously, but he didn't. He gave them back to the guy who gave him hammer. Another one is like they gave this one, it was chimpanzees, and they gave him they put bananas up on top of the roof, and hung it from a string, and they gave a box to the other ape. And it was just high enough where one ape had to stand on top of the box, and the other one had to climb on top of him to get the bananas. So, they both needed to have teamwork. So when they did that, the ape comes down with a bunch of bananas, and he grabs them, he runs into the corner, he's all excited, he's jumping around and stuff, and the other ape is kind of chasing him. And then, they watched these 2 apes, and then the one pulled off, I think there was 4 there. He pulled off 2 and gave it to the other one. It was something like that. I can't remember the exact reward, but he shared is the point, which is weird. He could just jump up and swing up to his little nest where he's got his little roost and just eat them all by himself. But
yeah.
He kind of rewarded him. But it's funny, that idea of give and take, and the fact that we should have kind of a just world is kind of ingrained in us.
Right. Like Voltaire famously mocked the idea of like a perfect world. There was a competing philosopher at the time, a German philosopher, who was all about like, this is the best of all possible worlds, and Voltaire just mocked that repeatedly. But it's true that we've almost been selected for it, right? Like it's useful for social species to expect a sense of justice, to expect people will get like what's coming to them. And so it's just one of those things that we all kind of believe without actually, even though all evidence is the contrary, right? Like good people die all the time, bad people prosper. Like the world functions as if there was no sense of justice. Like that's why we make up stories like, oh well, in the next life it'll all get sorted out, because otherwise there's just, and so we feel kind of upset when our movies don't follow that. Like some of the modern movies, like No Country for Old Men, a lot of the modern Coen Brothers movies are very like, no, this is just how the world is. Sometimes random things happen, and sometimes good people die, and there's no point to it.
Yeah, like The Wolf Among Us. Whenever, yeah, well, I guess I won't spoil anything, but yeah, the bad things happen, and you're like, what the heck? How is that fair?
And you just come away like watching The Wired or playing these games with this feeling of frustration and disappointment. Like you're like, no, that's not how it should be. And we have this like, remember there's a genre called realism that was anything but. Like in realism, books and movies, like things would just, everything would work out in the end. Everything would be fine. But in reality, that's not how it is. And that's why I like these games like the BioShock Infinite, The Last of Us, games without spoiling the ending. Like you get to the end, you're like, what was the point of that? There was no point. Like there's nothing going on. Like that was not the right ending. Like that should have ended differently. And you're like, well, sometimes things don't end the way they quote unquote should end. That's the whole point of George R. R. Martin, right? Like he says, okay, here's an important character. He's a real hero. He's gonna get things done and change the world because he's an honorable man. Decapitation.
Yeah, I think the way you could sort of test this is like a litmus test of like, is this one of these cases of kind of nihilistic movies or postmodern movies or games? I keep saying movies, but I'm thinking games whenever I'm saying it. Games is like you say, what's the moral of that game? Like old school games, like let's say, Double Dragon, for example. I beat the bad guy up and I got the girl back, and so that taught me that if you're a bad person and try to do bad things and take people and take things that you don't, that aren't yours, then you'll get what's coming to you,
Right.
and the good guy will always kind of win. But in these situations, it's like, no, I didn't really win. Like, but I did the best with what I could. I think that's the moral. Like, do the best with what you can, and bad shit's gonna happen.
Yeah, it's very much like we were talking about before with the absurdism. Like,
Oh, yeah.
just embrace the fact that there's no real rhyme or reason to things, and then just try and do the best you can anyway. That was like what we came away with the absurdist stuff. And it's like The Walking Dead, right? The season 1, where you're just
Yeah.
like, are you serious? Like, that's a really depressing ending, but I guess it's the best thing that could have happened in that situation.
Wow. Yeah. If you guys plan on playing that, then yeah, don't listen to what I'm about to say.
Yeah, it's hard to do this episode without spoilers. So just
Yeah.
this game's pretty old. Hopefully you've had a chance to play it if you want to.
Yeah, but that guy. Okay, so at the end, you end up kind of like in Bioshock Infinite, where your character. Yeah, this is another spoiler, but you kind of end up having to kill yourself. That also happens in this. Is like you determine if you want to kill yourself or just die or turn into a zombie in Walking Dead. So it's like that sucks, but that's the thing. Now that we have the immediacy of information showing that like people suffer all over the place and we're choosing to do nothing about it, that is we've got to make that fit into our narrative somehow. Where now it's like, okay, well, yeah, I mean the thing is things didn't work out well for Lee in Walking Dead. No, not at all. Or Bioshock Infinite for not Joel, Troy Baker. What's his main name though? The main character. Whatever.
I forget. Troy Baker.
Forget. Darn it, yeah. But it doesn't work out for him. But you just do the best you can anyway, and that's a great. Oh man, that's a great moral. We talk about that in ACT all the time. It's like, yeah, dude, get away from should and shouldn't and must, or this should have turned out my way. Yeah, it should have. I don't know what should have means though. I mean, like that's should have what based on your learning history. That would
and
be.
I think some part of us seems to enjoy that sense of disappointment because we keep going back to these games that just break our hearts. We keep watching these shows that like just break our hearts day after day, and we're just like, oh, it's like medicine. Like it's not pleasant, but it feels more like it's good for you, like it's substantive.
Well, my current hypothesis on that, just with psychologically, is that we like to be distressed. We like the feeling, the rush kind of being distressed or adrenaline or like worry, if and when we want it. So on our own parameters.
To choose it.
Yeah, I talked about this I think in the last episode. Is that we'd rather have pain or heartache if we can schedule it. Like in experimental conditions, we've shown this with subjects. They're fine with like bad stuff if they know when it's coming and they can say, oh, okay, I'll have it this long or this short or whatever.
I can imagine the experiment. Like with Control Group A, we just murdered a family member randomly, didn't tell them it was coming. But Control Group B, we let them choose the time and the place.
Who they wanted to murder. Yeah. Yeah, that kind of thing. But it's true. I mean, we do. It is kind of a fun experience to like. And we have to. When we sleep, we process a lot of these things that are distressing for us. And also like we when you say, oh, just give them some time over some grief or whatever, we ruminate about it. We try to make it right. We try to make it understand. We try to make it predictive. Like, how did that happen? How can I prevent this from happening in the future? And that kind of thing. But yeah, the conclusions you come to from those like questions are super important, and it's important to say, like, hey, there's nothing I can do about it. This is just part of life. If you're going to live in this enrichedness that we have, then you're also going to die. That's the price you pay. Death isn't something that you just, that you have to, avoid at all costs. And when it happens, it's super sad. I mean, it is, but in other words, it's like, well, that's the price you pay. It's like being uncomfortable at a football game. Like, you sit in those seats, and those aren't comfortable, but it's part of the price you pay to see the football game, and it's worth it. And I think everybody'd say that was worth it. Is if somebody says, hey, I got a way I can take death or sad things away, just don't ever live. I'm pretty sure people would say, well, okay, I'll take the pain and heartache. Can I get rid of those? You're like, nope, that's absolutely just part of it. And they're like, oh, well, sure. And if you look at it like that, like, that's part of my ticket that I paid for this. Part of being close to people is experiencing hurt along with the pain. It's like one of my professors said, he was one of the ACT theorists that started the whole thing. He said, what was it, values and vices, or I think it's values and vices are poured from the same vessel. A lot of V's, but you get the idea. Is like the good things and the bad things in life are all poured from the same spigot. You can't decide, that you just don't want one of them. If it's inherent in human nature. That's why Buddhists say, don't have like, traditional Buddhists say like don't have attachments to people, because inherent in that attachment is pain. But you also get like all this richness and happiness. So yeah, I think we're starting to come to that understanding in our games and movies too.
Yeah, and it's coming slowly. Like we still have a lot of things where we expect a double standard almost, like a karmic sense of like for example, do you ever see the movie True Lies?
Yes, yeah,
You remember that scene where the machine gun falls down the stairs and it just kills all the bad guys randomly?
yeah, yeah.
Like, play that scene again in your head, but instead it kills like 3 or 4 main characters along with some of the bad guys.
Right.
Like we'd feel so cheated. We'd be like, "What? No!" We'd walk away angry from that movie because it's like that's not how good guys are supposed to die. But if bad guys get mowed down that way, who cares? But in the real world, this randomism, like this randomness, is really like probably 2 or 3 people from each side would have died from that, and that's just how the world works. And video games are still kind of struggling with that a little bit, right? Like you'll be shooting a guy, and you'll do 2 shots and he'll die, whereas if they shoot you, you just take cover and you heal a little bit, and you come back and shoot them again. Like Joel is he kills armies by himself because we accept that as we suspend disbelief for that because we want that to happen because we want to live in a world where we want to live in a world where if you were in a post-apocalyptic world and 7 bandits were trying to kill you, you could reasonably take them all down.
Right. Yeah.
But that's not the world we live in. So even some of these games are like kind of toying with the idea of like what if things were lethal just like for the bad guys and what if you could die randomly, and people get frustrated by that because that's not the contract we sign on with the storytellers, right? Like if we were playing Edge of the Empire and like I killed one of your characters the way some of these people, so the bad guys have died, like let's say you're walking by a door and like these 2 blades come through and just skewer like you and John's character, you're like, what? I'm like, sorry, there's a guy there and he was waiting to skewer you, and you're like, well, that's stupid. I'm like, well, it's not stupid when it happens to the bad guys.
Yeah, like, or we just come out of hyperspace in a planet and we all die. Like,
yeah,
that happens, man.
That happens in Star Wars, but you would feel cheated. And it's a sense like we're talking about of expectations. Like we expect in the end the good guys, if we die, it's going to be something like, to advance the story, like avenge my death, and I just saved a whole planet. Like Chewbacca roaring at the moon is like he evacuates all the inhabitants of the planet before he dies in the EU. Like we expect death, if it happens to good guys, to happen for a reason, not just because life is random and sometimes people die.
And it's often their choice, like in
like a self-sacrifice.
Yeah, I was about to reference something, but I don't want to spoil it. But yeah, it's this decision like, no, this is there's something greater than us, and we're gonna do this. Yeah, it's pretty cool, and I like it when people make that decision because that is an informed decision. To experience pain is super important. You're being naive if you think that you can cut out all pain and heartache. You can't. Instead, you just say, this is a part of it. And that way when it comes, it's not that big of a deal. The funny thing is, like, I think that a lot of this, is because we got this. I don't know. I also think there's like a cyclical nature to it. It's like because anything that is scarce or new or novel to a new generation is going to be tempting. Like you get your goths, you got your like grunge people, and then before that you had your hippies. You got these people who are counterculturists, culturalists, and that's necessarily going to leak into like some of our entertainment forms, and that's happening I think now to video games. But and I think eventually that becomes the dominant culture. So I think like the flower power thing was kind of became somewhat dominant. So I don't know. That's how we remember the 70s.
Yeah, that's cyclical nature, and I think a lot of it too is just the fact that darkness needs a place to go in our art, and it used to be music would cover a lot. Like I remember a lot of the screamo, like the emo and the punk and the just really talking about or the old like Compton kind of rap, just about how dark life is and about really kind of gritty subject matter.
Yeah.
Whereas now you look like a top 100 list, it's like number 1 song is like Happiness, and then I Had a Great Summer, and then like Pool Party with My Friends. Like it's super cheerful now. Like what we're listening to is music, and so movies are kind of picking that up. And I think games, because they always look to movies for their references, and they always they're like we want to be taken seriously as an art form the way film and TV are. I think they're kind of going that same direction because that's where film and television are going.
Yeah, at least the very best ones, like the ones that get the most acclaim. Critical acclaim, not necessarily the most popular. Like Call of Duty got shit for critical acclaim, but it's obviously
right. Call of Duty is like the Big Bang Theory of video games, right? Where it's like not like an art, but it's still very popular and people have fun with it.
Yeah, you're shooting for center masses in like a marketing where you have your axes of creativity and repetition, and then the other axis would be like I guess popularity.
And mass market appeal.
Yeah, they're really shooting for like as much of that like space in that graph as possible. So they're like yes, we want to be super popular. So inch towards that size, but also just get everyone you can. And if we miss kind of the creativity on it, that's fine. We're just making another part in the franchise. Because that's not what they're going for. They're going for bottom lines. They aren't looking for critical acclaim. They're looking for profit. And so if you're shooting for profit, shoot for the middle, shoot for that
Right.
100 IQ, shoot for that those average Joes.
But every
And you're
once
gonna
in a while, the games that get really good critical acclaim, because you want, as a studio, you want to be able to fund your games. So you're going to make your Calls of Duties and your Maddens, but you also want some critical acclaim too, because it adds prestige to your studio. So
yeah.
you budget, you get a bigger budget for your for your artsy games from these bigger games.
So it's like Ubisoft.
Yeah, like Ubisoft. I was going to say Ubisoft because remember, Beyond Good and Evil was
Yeah.
only funded because they were doing so well with Rayman.
That's like Child of Light from their Assassin's Creed budget.
Yeah.
You know, you make these big like flagship games, and then then you make your projects of love, which I
Right.
like.
So you're going to need to have some Call of Duties if you're going to want to have your Black Ops: The Line games or Spec
Yeah.
Ops: The Line.
Yeah, that's a good game. But yeah, but I like that. Yeah, that's another one. Shoot, I forgot to mention that in the kind of horrible the ending where you're kind of like, well, I'm not satisfied, but I'm kind of satisfied because it wasn't too cherry-ish, you know?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, would you prefer games to kind of give you that everything got wrapped up, everything satisfied, good guys won, hero got the girl, Hollywood endings, or do you prefer to have that like feeling of discomfort, that anxiety of like, what? Oh God, and like walking away, like the Mark of the Ninja ending, where you're just like, the fuck? Like which would you prefer to have, or do you like to have a mix of both?
Well, actually, I definitely like the bad quote unquote endings, the endings that like everything kind of doesn't end up working out, because isn't it hard to isn't the one thing that keeps us from wanting the happy things is we would just walk away saying that's just not believable, or that's a little too fluffy, doesn't match up with my experiences in the real world.
Normally, but it seems like what happens more often is we just agree to suspend disbelief on that. Like at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy, I walked away going like, that was a good movie. I had a good time, even though everything got wrapped up nicely with a bow and like they had to do some like pretty crazy stuff to make that work.
That's true. Yeah, I guess there's the overriding, like Thanos problem, because in Guardians of the Galaxy, the main bad guy isn't the biggest, baddest guy in the world. I won't give any spoilers away, but there's someone above him.
Right.
And this is sort of like it wrapped up nicely, and I guess it is. I mean, it's still pretty happy.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's
without going into specifics, like they had to kind of go like, but still happy ending because magic, or because whatever, they had some kind of reason for everything working out the way it did. But like I didn't care. I like to, sometimes it's fun to just suspend disbelief because we don't. It's escapism, right? We don't live in a world where your friends come back to life if they die, or the good guys win against all odds. And so it's fun to kind of go to that and like turn our brains off and be like, okay, yeah, that probably wouldn't happen, but what a good movie, what a good story. Like we tell stories expecting a narrative arc and expecting the hero to win at the end. Like that's kind of the unspoken contracts we have with the storyteller. It's like, you're gonna give me a good ending, right? And he's like, yeah, just stick around.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. You're entering a contract, like you mentioned before, of like basically the storyteller's saying this is gonna be great. Sit down and watch, and you and you pay your money or whatever, your time, and you listen. And if it's not great, then you're like, that wasn't great. I died in a hyperspace jump on a moon. And they're like, yeah, I know. And you're like, oh man,
you feel cheated.
The funny thing is, the one super heroic moment in Guardians of the Galaxy, well, I guess there's two, because there's always going to be a big one near the end, right, of all Marvel movies. But the one part where like there's kind of a super heroic moment, the writer kind of poked fun at it, and was like, dude, that was like there was a self-referential moment where he's like, I just experienced the most heroic part of my life, like like he kind of jokes about it because of the fact that it doesn't quite fit his character per se without us going, oh, it's a little cheesy. You know what I mean? Like the superhero part of it. So yeah, I like that. I like the fact that like that made it more okay with me, because if that scene would have happened and he wouldn't have said like self-referential and like I was super heroic just now, then it kind of would have ruined the character. The character's more like a Flynn Rider. He's an anti-hero, or like but I guess Flynn Rider, he's in it for himself.
Yeah, or a Han Solo. Like it's a common trope, right? The scoundrel with a heart of gold who starts off in it for the money and then ends up becoming a hero.
Something more, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
But I think for me, like I think in general, like I want like 70% of my movies and games to have that kind of feeling of like, yeah, everything worked out and it was a happy ending, because life isn't that way and it's fun to escape. But I like every once in a while somebody just like poking that and turning it on its head and saying, no, this is how life is. I like an occasional Game of Thrones or an occasional Last of Us or BioShock Infinite where the ending isn't happy and maybe the good guys died for no reason, because that kind of keeps me from being complacent. Like if it happened all the time, I would just get depressed and wouldn't want to watch movies all the time. But if you just maybe 20 to 30% of this stuff just ends up that way, that's what makes it momentous for me. And I go, yeah, oh man, that's brilliant. And I don't feel, it's like The Last of Us. It wasn't a fun game to play, but I enjoyed it.
Huh. Yeah, so gameplay, or you mean the experience was better, but the gameplay wasn't great?
Well, the gameplay was fine. There were some problems with the gameplay, but I mean, like, I always felt stressed and sad in the game. It wasn't a game where I'm like,
Oh,
I'm
right.
having fun right now. It was like, this is a grim world and everything sucks. And I just felt like it was in that kind of best of all possible worlds. Nope, not really. This place sucks kind of thing where I'm just like, this is not fun. Like, I kind of dread logging into it because I'm going to escape into a world where everything sucks and people die. But it was still like overall, I felt like it was a good experience when I got out of it. It's not a world I'd like to live in.
Yeah, right. Well, it kind of makes me think of the two parts of, I mean, two parts of therapy, but the two most like phases of therapy. One is like we call it rapport building, and the second one is therapy, treatment. And so
Mhm.
like during the first part, during the clinical interview and everything else, you empathize with the person and you understand where they are on a world map, basically. Like I get it. Here's your situation, and you put your finger directly on it and you repeat it back to them at the end of the clinical interview. And if you're wrong, they'll let you know. And you say, is there anything about that I don't get? And once you've shown them that, it's like that's kind of what those games are doing. I think they're saying like, this is, you're like, yeah, that they get it. This is how it would be, in a post-apocalyptic world. Whereas like then you get your superhero games where you're like, but this is the way I wish it could be. It's
Mhm.
almost satisfying two separate parts. And that's kind of what we do with treatment. Is we say, here's where you are. Here's where you can be, and what do you think about that? And they're like, oh yeah, and I'll be like, it's gonna be a journey, man. It takes some work. Unlearning habits sucks, especially like habits, cognitive habits. Like,
You must
uh,
unlearn what you have learned.
yeah. And so like I think the superhero movie type things is allowing us to say, oh, but I wish it could be this way, But it's a happy fantasy, but yeah, and I think yeah that really helps establish like relative happiness in a way, because like the funny thing is whenever you take surveys of how happy people are, the funny thing is when we measure variation, it's real tight around a mean, around a certain average, right? We all say we're pretty happy about what we're doing, even like super rich people, and then like pretty poor people. The variance isn't what you'd expect, which would be like 1 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, you'd expect some people saying 1 if they live in like the suburbs of or not suburbs, like let's say like super rural Mississippi, for example, probably the worst place in the United States. You've got no education, there's absolutely no money, poverty, there's no health care, there's nothing, right? And they're having kids and they're dying of AIDS, and there's West Nile virus down here, that's a thing. Like, this place sucks, so you'd expect a 1, but no, they usually stay around like a 4 or so, and you're like, what the hell? And then you get people who are like super rich, like if you're a Walton, for example, home of Walmart, or the owners of Walmart, the inventors, or I guess entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial family, they have all the money in the world. They just started a museum just for the fun of it, and it's the best in the United States now, as rated by like a few different magazines.
Mm.
And they just started it with their own money, just because, you'd think that they would rate their life at like a 10, but no, they say like a 6 or 7, which is weird, right? Because you'd expect they'd, it's
Right.
this idea of relative happiness. Your surroundings, the stimulus outside of you does not dictate whether you're going to be happy or not. That's completely up to how you interpret it. Their stresses are nothing compared to someone in rural Mississippi, but the fact that they assign so much value to those decisions does,
Mhm.
it's yeah, it's like that I mentioned in the last podcast of the clinical psychologist talking about the pencil holding it out, or the pen.
Right.
It's your relationship to that pen is what is getting you,
Right. Not the way of the pen.
Yeah, so like here, I think the fact that like we're not allowing ourselves to be as happy with the happy endings, is part of this idea of like relative happiness. No matter how good you have it in life, you're always going to look for stress and ways that you can like kind of change things around.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's interesting. Just as I was doing the research for this episode, like looking back at like the most popular games of 2013 and 2014, like I was like, I had fun with Pokemon. I had fun with this game. I had fun with that game. But the games I loved, the games I just like that really hold a special place in my heart, are these games that kind of take the expectation of karma and the expectation of like storytelling, and they say, nope, this is actually what it's going to be, and they have this kind of darkness to them. The Last of Us, the Bioshock Infinite, the Walking Dead, the Lords of Shadow 2, like some of the most fun Star Wars storylines are the evil side. Like these games, like I don't know, they're not as fun to play when I'm playing them, but they leave a longer lasting impression for me.
Yeah, me too. It's pretty crazy, man. It's all about making a worthwhile tale out of a miserable situation, I think.
Hmm. And it's the
And
same reason we both love Game of Thrones. It's the same principle at play.
yeah. Jeez, reading those books is so much worse than even the movie or the shows. But
I know the shows. At least you know it's coming in the shows. Like you're not the people who haven't read the books and they're just like watching horrified as everyone gets murdered. Like it's so much worse in the books because you're like, Uh,
Oh, and there's so many more characters that like the lethality isn't like no when all the main characters start dying, that's no big deal in the show because that's who's around. But
yeah.
like in the books, like random characters die all the time, and then when it finally strikes one of the main characters, you're like, holy crap! Even they're not impervious, you know. And so it's this pox of like it's like everyone in their surrounding neighborhoods catching a zombie virus, and when it happens to someone you know, that's like the oh shit moment. And then you're staring at horror as it keeps happening outside, and then another one inside, and you're like oh like it's that feeling. Whereas like the movies, it's just like all they're not showing anyone on the outside, and it's all just your inside people. So when it happens, you're like, well, yeah, there goes another person. This happens. But yeah, anyway, yeah, I do like a little realism. It makes the sweeter moments all the more sweet.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I can't. There's a couple other psychological concepts, but I think they just take too long to talk about. I'm sure we can cover them in some other place.
Yeah, I think we did a pretty good analysis of why these games are so popular, and if you haven't heard that Cracked podcast and you're more interested in like the music and the TV shows aspect of it, like go check that out because they brought up some really good points too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, smart guys over there. But yeah, so I guess that wraps up the in-depth analysis. If you want to move on to the feedback section,
Sure.
let's do it. All right, the feedback section. So, no new iTunes reviews.
We do have a new email.
Yes.
This one is from Brooke, and the subject was Canada Strikes Back. So you can imagine my trepidation when I saw the subject line. I was like, oh no, we've offended Canada. They're going to send Mounties down and they're going to arrest us and politely. So
You're such a jerk, man. Canada's awesome.
Yeah, it is. So here's the email. Dear sirs, recently my Igloo was wired up for the internet, and I began listening to your fine podcast about gaming and related psychology facts.
Quote unquote.
Facts are in quotes, yeah. So I was oot in a boot on the roof of my house when episode 34, Roguelikes, came on. Why am I giving her a cultured accent? She's Canadian. I'm not sure if you remember, but the two of you had a brief conversation in which you discussed Canada, our culture, our dialect, and Kickstarter boobs. You mentioned that we Canadians might be offended by your comments and might stop downloading your show as a result, eh? Nothing could be further from the truth. I would like to thank you for mentioning our country on the interwebs. I'm glad that such learned podcasters know that Canada is a real place and not fictional, such as Atlantis, Hogwarts, or New Orleans, invented by Anne Rice for the Interview with the Vampire book. I always suspected that's why New Orleans was invented. We Canadians take our country very seriously, and any podcast that I know that knows how we based our monetary system on monopoly currency should be encouraged to continue disseminating a positive image of our great nation. The years of suffering after the great monopoly economic crash of 2001 and the thousands of starving seniors that were forced to fly down to Florida and live in gated communities still serves as a warning to our younger generation of the folly of putting up hotels everywhere where 4 houses is clearly the better strategy. Thanks again, Brooke from Canada, eh?
That is epic.
I know, I cracked up when I read this. Very funny. Thank you, Brooke. We laughed out loud. You were aggressively polite, which is typical for Canadians, but well played. Well played, madam. Well played indeed.
We know a lot about Canada. You've shown us that through your email. Thank you. Great monopoly economic crash of 2001.
Yeah, we glossed over that in our American history class. I was glad to learn some more insight into that.
Yeah.
4 houses is obviously the better strategy.
Actually, we don't know. We don't learn shit about Canada in our history classes. So.
Here's what we cover in Canada. The French came over and started trapping furs in the 16 and 1700s, and then Canada happened at some point.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think most Americans know the War of 1812 even happened.
What?
Like, we know that there was a War of 1812, but I don't think most people could tell you who we fought.
No, I don't know.
About. Yeah.
I don't remember, and that's like a lot of history.
Significant part of that was a pretty big part of our American Canadian history.
Oh man, I didn't even know we had
Canada. Well, back then Canada was still kind of England, but still.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I know nothing. I was playing a South Park game, and when you run in and there was like a prince, I was like, I didn't know. I thought they had a royalty, but I didn't even know. I know nothing about Canada. But everybody I've met from Canada, and I guess that's not quite the same experience as yours. I thought they were great people. There's some really. Some of them are goofy, but...
I met a lot of douchebags from Canada. Like, when you travel abroad, I think the Canadians who travel maybe are, like, worse than the ones at home or something, because the first thing they want to do is tell you about how much greater Canada is than America. I'm like, I get it. You guys have way better healthcare. I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix that. Please stop making me feel bad about it.
And I met some Canadian soldiers. There are such a thing. And in Kuwait, I believe, when we were moving along, yeah, and they were good guys, man. They encouraged us to have like a drink off because they're like, we hear that you Americans think you can hold your beer. I was like, well, yeah, we're like little Germany, and they were like, yeah, right, we'll show you how to really drink. I was like, what, a Molson's? And that's funny if you know what beer is, but Molson's is a Canadian beer, and it's like 3% or something. It's like I'm sure it's like our Budweiser, so they probably are like, shut up, that's not our main, but. Canada, man. I like that place.
I've been watching. You shut your mouth. Get off the show. Huddling for warmth on the southern border, like a homeless Eskimo. Can't believe you.
Homeless Eskimo. That's how they live.
No, I was watching Fly the Conchords, and they had that kind of same running joke I have with Canada about New Zealand on that one.
Yeah.
And there was this one reference in season 2, which was really funny. Brett was going to be a bodyguard, and for the Prime Minister of New Zealand who was visiting. He's like, I can't be a bodyguard. I don't have a gun. And then Murray's like, well, you can pretend you have a gun. He's like, well, can't we get a gun? Doesn't the New Zealand Army have a gun? He's like, oh, that's right, they do have a gun, but doesn't New Zealand have a gun? He's like, oh, right, we do, but the New Zealand Army has it right now.
Has it?
So it's like, oh yeah, we can't get it from them. They might need it. the one gun that New Zealand owns.
Awesome.
It's funny. So we also got some feedback from your last episode on our Facebook group. Apparently, I'm no longer necessary.
Really?
Yeah, Jamie Hart, on the Facebook group said, I'm no literature analyst, sorry dude, but that was funny, or anything, but I just got done listening to this week's show. I think Jeremiah and Amy should do their own podcast just on psychology. Don't get me wrong, I love the Game Theory podcast, and I think David and Jeremiah are great together, but I also feel like Jeremiah and Amy could bring out another aspect of discussion that I enjoy, human behaviors. Plus, I commute a ton during the week, and I think another podcast about human behavior would be a great addition.
Well, yeah, I mean, Amy's been kind of backburnering the thought of like doing a podcast. And of course, I would probably be on it as well. About like, I think hers is more about parenting or idea, but obviously you talk about most psychological principles when you talk about parenting.
Right.
So she has a very long, extensive history of working with parents and parenting. She's been doing this for years, but me, I'm just now starting. But what's cool about mine is that we get more into the science of it. Like they work in like therapy. Counselor specialty is therapy, so they learn how to do it. You know, how best to connect with the client, how to keep them where they feel a certain way, all that. Psychologists, our focus is how it works. We're not all that good at therapy, but it's very much a side thought. We expected to teach it, learn how to do it on our own, and we're just like slightly overviewed, like once a week, to kind of say how's it going. We don't know how to do it very well. Like I don't have the same presence that she does in the room, you know, like where they connect with her and stuff like that. I feel like a lot of times I'm a little cold and mechanical because I know exactly what's driving it, and then I just need to make this client see that. Yeah, so we understand the principles of how it works, and they understand how to communicate that language. So in the very best scenario, you'd have a psychologist who is overseeing a therapist and then telling them exactly what to do, and the therapist would do it. But that is a lot of money for one client, and we'd have to charge you like $300 an hour, and that's crazy. So typically it's one or the other. So if you want to feel connected to, and like the person will get you somewhere, that's a counselor. And if you want to make sure you're get where you need to be, but also they might suck at it, and be really awkward and weird, than the psychologist.
So what you're saying is your podcast is going to have a value of $300 to $400 a week.
Dude, that is the thing. Yeah, I mean, like I thought about that. I was like, wow, we're really just giving away, like, because she develops classes on this stuff, and I've developed a couple PowerPoints on this stuff. Like, so yeah, we usually charge out the butt for that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, whatever. Podcast. I'd rather see people get help than
get rich.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's not true, but I do have a passion to getting this stuff out there because so many people have misperceptions of psychology. But thank you for the thought. That was really cool. I'll let Amy know.
Yeah, that's really nice for Amy. She must feel really good about that.
Well, we got to have an analyst here, so
it's nice to know that if you're gone, like the show just gets better.
Yeah.
No, but yeah. So keep your. And this is kind of on the back burner, but I know you and Amy have been talking for a long time about doing a parenting psychology therapy, raising kids podcast. So I think that would be appealing to a lot of our listeners, especially since there's a lot of parents.
Yeah, well, that would be cool. If and when she gets it kicked off, it's gonna have to be her baby. I've got so many projects right now with all the jobs I've got and the EPPP and just everything. I've taught myself to not keep saying yes to things. So it's totally up to her, and she is very busy right now. So if she gets kicked off, though, then we will, or probably win. We'll obviously cross-pollinate here and tell you guys to check us out. For anyone that has parent or kids or is at all interested in that kind of thing, it should be really good quality.
Yeah, definitely. Keep an eye out for that, and tell Amy, tell her the public is clamoring for a Jeremiah and Amy podcast.
I'll do that. Maybe I'll start a poll or something just to see how many people would be interested, like how much cross-pollination, or like, yeah, just to see if we can get a jump start.
For sure.
But, yeah. Any more feedback besides we had, Facebook activity? People were posting videos to check out, things like that.
Yeah, there were some interesting questions on the Facebook group. Somebody asked like, what world do you like to get lost in, like immersed in? And that made me think of like, what game world would you want to end up in if you and your friends got trapped in a video game, kind of like in the old Dungeons and Dragons cartoon where you all end up in that game.
Right. Yeah.
And but you're also like the characters, right? So if you choose Star Fox, you might be Fox, but you might be Slippy. It's all random.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of interesting answers. A lot of people chose MMOs, I think. A lot of people were into like World of Warcraft or Skyrim, kind of these big open worlds.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, I'd probably. I mean, yeah, and they're the most fleshed out and like realized. So you're like, oh, I can see myself living here.
I think my favorite answer was Smash Brothers. Somebody was discussing like, it's just you called it Nintendo Valhalla. Just every day you're just fighting all the Nintendo greats, then you get back up and do it again. No one dies.
My favorite was this is from Byron. He's pretty active. He said, "Flight Simulator." Reasons? He said, "Reasons: flying is fun. Enemies: cancer."
The cancer is an enemy.
Yeah, I was like, that's a very thorough thought about that. It's true.
And somebody surprisingly, I think Rachel went for The Wolf Among Us, which just seems like a depressing world to live in. Like it's a slum, like, and everyone's just kind of like shitty and doesn't have enough money and they're prostitutes and stuff. So, like, it's a great world to read about. I don't know if I'd want to be one of the fables in that world.
Right. Yeah. I may just want to be an onlooker. Like someone who like saw beyond the glamour somehow, and then just wasn't part of the community.
Yeah, like it's the same reason. Like I love the Last of Us, the setting and the story and the characters, but I would not want to be Joel or Ellie. Like their lives are terrible.
Ever. Yeah.
So yeah, interesting discussions. If you guys want to join in on that, just join our Facebook group, facebook.com/group/GameTheoryPodcast.
And that is groups as in plural. Groups.
Yes, groups is in plural, and then Game Theory Podcast, one word. Or you can send us an email at thegametheorypodcast@gmail.com. So let's say maybe you're from New Zealand and you want to write to tell us that there are more than one gun in the country, and Fly the Conchords said it wrong. You can be like Brooke and strike back for your nation.
Yes. My esteem of Canadians has gone up even more.
Yes, I had to say, well played, Canadians, well played.
Well played, Canada.
Canada.
Also, yeah, check out our Twitter at twitter.com/GameTheoryPodcast. I am not a huge poster on there, but when I run across like interesting studies or gaming things, I put it up there. But if you're interested in the psychological part of this podcast, then definitely go check it out and follow us on Twitter. It's twitter.com/GameTheoryPod, not podcast. Pod. I don't know what I said.
Yeah.
But at any rate,
yeah. Just to make it really confusing, the Facebook group is Game Theory Podcast. The email address is The Game Theory Podcast. And the Twitter is Game Theory Pod.
Yeah, sorry about that. That's maybe we can get that fixed someday, but
probably not because we're really bad at this.
Yeah, social media is not our forte, or we wouldn't be able to bring you all this hopefully in-depth content because we'd be so good.
We spend all of our character points on other knowledge skills.
Yeah. But anyway, so next episode, what do you think?
Next episode's our big number 50. So
Whoa.
Just by the reason, for some reason, we think of things in terms of 50s and 100s and 10s.
Yeah.
So significant.
We can make it the 50, or we could do it the 52, which would mean 1 year. Or 1 year podcast. One of those might be big.
Yeah, so one of those might be big. The other one might be, we're thinking about doing something called the Art of Wargaming.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the Art of War and how it ties in with games in general, like the thoughts and the concepts proposed there.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this with, was it David Sterlin?
Yeah.
But it made me realize, like, I need to go back and reread that book because it's been about 15 years, and I was just not impressed with it the first time through.
Yeah. We'll definitely have a realistic approach to it. Like, here's where it applies, and here's where it definitely doesn't. But it should be interesting. I think it's a cool thought.
And I'm also, now that I'm back in my command center, I'm going to start sending out those emails again and get our cosplayers lined up, our myriad and varied cosplaying friends.
Yeah, this would be great time for that because Comic-Con just happened in San Diego.
Yeah, and there's been some great costumes, as there usually are.
Yeah, so it depends on how quickly people get back to us and whatnot, but we'll have one of those good episodes, I think, lined up for you guys. But.
So, in the meantime, don't get too depressed with your media. Stay classy.
Yeah, and remember, look for the positive inside of those depressing scenarios. The silver lining on the dark cloud, or some nonsense.
Oh, that's so inspirational, Jeremiah. I'm gonna put that on a poster with a kitten that says "Hang in there."
Oh my gosh, it's that very thing. That's why I cringe sometimes in therapy. But anyway, yeah, I guess that pretty much wraps up this episode. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Game Theory Podcast. I usually say this is Jeremiah and this is Dave, but I feel like that's cheesy. Let's not do that. Let's
Okay.
do let's do something.
How will they know who we were?
I know. We tell them to stay classy, San Diego.
Oh, I don't think that's been done before.
Yeah. Okay. So stay classy, San Diego. All right.
Right.
Bye.